The universe operates on laws, not the kind written in precinct ledgers or corporate compliance documents, but deeper ones, the kind that govern how matter behaves, how energy moves, how cause produces effect in an unbroken chain stretching back to the first moment of creation. Alex Murphy had always believed in laws. They were the architecture of civilization. Remove them, and everything collapses into chaos. He was about to learn that some universes had made their peace with chaos. A long time ago, his optical sensors came online first. Standard reboot sequence, threat assessment before motor function, weapon status before speech synthesis. The data that flooded his systems in those first 3 seconds was simultaneously familiar and completely wrong. Atmosphere, breathable nitrogen-oxygen mix, trace pollutants at levels that would kill an unaugmented human within a decade of chronic exposure. Temperature, elevated, consistent with heavy industrial operation. Sound, the rhythmic hammering of enormous machinery. Chanted liturgical text in a language his translator protocols could not identify. And underneath both, a deep electromagnetic hum that resonated against the sensors. In his chest cavity like a second heartbeat. He was indoors. A vast chamber, cathedral scale, if cathedrals were also foundries. The ceiling vaulted upward into darkness, threaded with chains and crane mechanisms, each linked the size of a ground car. Furnaces lined the walls like the mouths of buried gods, pouring red-orange light across a floor of black iron plate. The air tasted of hot metal and incense, and something older, something that had no chemical classification in any database he carried. RoboCop stood up. The figures surrounding him stumbled backward. There were 11 of them. He logged each in under a second, robed in red and gray, their faces hidden behind hoods or replaced entirely by optical implants and rebreather masks. Several had arms that terminated not in hands, but in tools, drills, manipulator claws, welding torches now pointing at him with the nervous energy of people who had reached for the nearest weapon without thinking. One, taller than the rest, bore a staff topped with a symbol he didn't recognize, a cog bisected by a lightning bolt, and stood its ground, while the others retreated. Its face, what remained of it, was a lattice of bronze and flesh, eyes replaced by spinning lens arrays that contracted and expanded as they focused on him. Designation, it said. The word arrived in his audio processors, not as sound but as a binary squeal translated by something in the chamber's own systems. State your designation and your Mechanicus affiliation. State the STC template from which you were manufactured. State your machine spirit's liturgical registry number. RoboCop processed the questions. None of them had answers he could provide. My name is Murphy, he said. His voice synthesizer sounded wrong in this room. Too flat, too clean, not suffused with the harmonic distortion of whatever these beings used for speech. Alex Murphy, Officer, Detroit Metropolitan Police. Badge number. This designation is not recognized. The tall figure stepped closer, lens eyes spinning faster now. Your alloy composition does not correspond to any known STC template. Your internal power source emits a signature inconsistent with plasma, promethium, or standard capacitor arrays. Your machine spirit responds to interrogation but does not speak the lingua technis. A pause. The lens arrays contracted to pinpoints. What are you? It was, RoboCop reflected, a reasonable question. He had the last clear memory of a parking structure in old Detroit. Rain. 3 men whose threat profiles his systems had already been compiling before they opened fire. Then nothing, a gap in his recording. Buffers that his diagnostics flagged as a dimensional transit event, which was a category of incident that had not previously existed in his operational parameters. Whatever had happened in that gap had moved him from one reality to another, and while his chassis had arrived intact, his navigational reference points had not. He was somewhere he had never been. He had no jurisdiction here. He had no precinct, no dispatch, no chain of command. His primary directives pulsed in steady sequence at the base of his cognitive architecture. Serve the public trust. Protect the innocent. Uphold the law. The question, already forming like ice in the deeper circuits of what had once been Alex Murphy's mind, was which law applied here. I'm a police officer, he said. It was the most honest answer he had. The tall figure. He would later learn its title was Mugos Explorator. Its name an unpronounceable string of binary that it graciously shortened to Mugos Veth, conferred with its subordinates in rapid-fire machine code. He could hear it, but not parse it. Whatever language these people used for private communication, it was layered in encryption his systems weren't built to crack. He cataloged the argument's emotional tone instead: urgency, disagreement. What he was fairly certain was awe. And underneath all of it, fear. They were afraid of him. He understood that. People were often afraid of him. He had learned, in the years since his reconstruction, that a walking titanium enforcement platform triggered atavistic threat responses in humans, regardless of the badge on his chest. He had also learned that the best response to that fear was not aggression and not retreat. It was calm. It was the steady, legible performance of law. Show them what you are. Show them you are predictable. Show them that the rules you follow are real and consistent. And eventually the fear became something more workable. He stood still. He let them look. He ran his own assessment of the chamber's exits. 4 ground-level doors. 2 upper gantries. 1 massive blast door at the far end large enough to admit a vehicle, and filed the information without acting on it. He was not a prisoner yet. He would not behave like one until he was certain. That was the appropriate classification. Mugos Veth turned back to him. You will accompany us, it said. The senior magi must examine you. You are either a relic of the omniscience, grace, or an abomination that must be purged. We will determine which. Murphy looked at the robed figures, at the tools that were also weapons, at the foundry light playing across a ceiling that had never existed on any Earth he knew. I'll cooperate, he said. I'd like some answers too. It was, under the circumstances, the most he could offer. He filed the situation under unknown jurisdiction. Proceed with caution and followed the red-robed figures through a door that sealed behind him with the weight of a verdict not yet delivered. Outside, in the hive city that neither of them could see from the sealed sanctum, bells were ringing. Not the electronic alerts of a police precinct. Something older. Something that had been ringing since before Detroit existed. Since before Earth existed. In a universe that had been at war with itself for 10,000 years. RoboCop didn't know that yet. He would. If you want to see more characters collide with impossible universes, hit that subscribe button and drop a name in the comments. Who should face the darkness next? Live long and prosper. The corridors of the Mechanicus Sanctum were not built for comfort. They were built for function. And function here meant something closer to worship than engineering. Every pipe and conduit ran in patterns that were simultaneously practical and liturgical, blessed at their joints with strips of parchment covered in dense script. Their surfaces, etched with binary prayers that, repeated in loops too small for unaugmented eyes to read. RoboCop read them as he walked. His optical sensors had no difficulty with the scale. He didn't understand the language. But the repetition suggested devotion. And devotion suggested a belief system. And belief systems were information he needed. Mugos Veth walked ahead of him. For Skitarii Rangers, soldiers. Clearly, their long coats. Concealing weapons his threat assessment. Pinged with professional interest, flanked him on either side. They moved with the rigid precision of beings whose nervous systems had been partially replaced by something more reliable than biology. He recognized the principle. He lived it. The sanctum opened, eventually, into a larger space. A council chamber, circular, ringed with tiered seating, occupied by more red-robed figures whose degree of mechanical augmentation increased in direct proportion to their apparent seniority. At the far end of the circle, 3 magi sat elevated above the rest, their bodies so thoroughly rebuilt that the original human architecture was a rumor, buried under brass and bronze and softly glowing optical arrays. They observed his entry with the focused attention of engineers, examining an unexpected variable. He stopped in the center of the circle without being told. It was the right position, central, visible, non-threatening in posture. He had stood in front of review boards before. The geometry was familiar, even if nothing else was. Unit designation Murphy. The central Mugos spoke without moving anything that resembled a mouth. The words arrived through the chamber's own speaker system, resonant and precise. You were recovered from the activation point of an unclassified dimensional rupture in Forge Chamber 17. Your alloy composition includes a titanium vanadium, blend consistent, with advanced but non-standard template construct manufacture. Your cognitive architecture is partially organic, partially synthetic, in a configuration our magi have not previously cataloged. You carry weapons of a pattern unknown to the Adeptus Mechanicus. You are, by every measurable standard, an anomaly. That's accurate, RoboCop said. A murmur moved through the tiered seating. His blunt confirmation had surprised them. He noted that and filed it. They expected either denial or incomprehension from anomalies. You claim to be a law enforcement officer, the Central Muggos continued. From a polity called Detroit. Our records contain no such polity, no such world designation, no such governmental structure. Our records are extensive. A pause that carried the weight of 10,000 years of accumulated data. Where do you come from, Unit Murphy? He considered the question with the same methodical honesty he had always applied to incident reports. A different reality, he said. My world operates on different physical and political principles than yours appears to. I don't know the mechanism that brought me here. I don't know if it can be reversed. I know what I am, I know what my function is, and I know that I'm currently operating without jurisdiction or command. Authority. Another pause. I'm telling you this because deception would be inefficient. You have sensors. You would identify inconsistencies in any false account I provided. The left Muggos leaned forward on a mechadendrite. Its honesty subroutines appear genuine, remarkable for a non-sanctioned cognitive architecture. To him directly, you are aware that an artificial intelligence operating without Mechanicus sanction is classified as an abominable intelligence under imperial law, that the penalty for harboring such an entity is death, that the entity itself is subject to immediate destruction. I wasn't aware of those specific statutes, RoboCop said. I am now, and I'm not an artificial intelligence. I'm a human being who was extensively rebuilt after sustaining fatal injuries in the line of duty. There's a distinction. The organic components of my cognition originate with Alex Murphy, Detroit PD. The synthetic components support and augment that cognition. I don't operate autonomously. I operate according to directives and my own judgment. He let the chamber absorb that. If your law criminalizes what I am, I'd want to examine that law carefully before accepting its legitimacy. The murmur in the chamber this time was louder. Several junior magi exchanged rapid machine code commentary that his systems still couldn't parse. Muggos Veth, standing to his left, had gone very still in the manner of a being recalibrating its threat assessment in real time. The Central Muggos was quiet for a long moment. When it spoke again, the register had shifted, less interrogation, more something that might, in a biological being, have been called careful curiosity. You would challenge imperial law. I'd want to understand it first. In my experience, law that can't withstand scrutiny usually can't withstand application. Either. He paused. Who wrote it? Who enforces it? Who does it protect? And who does it harm? No one in the chamber had an immediate answer. That told him something. Before the council could reconvene its deliberation, the chamber's Vox system crackled. A voice came through, different from the Mechanicus's synthesized tones, rougher, carrying the particular authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in loud and dangerous environments. Mechanicus. This is Arbitrator Signoris Draken, Adeptus Arbites, High Voltes Precinct Command. We've received your anomalous contact report. The subject in your custody falls under Imperial jurisdiction, not Mechanicus jurisdiction. Stand down your security protocols and prepare for transfer. RoboCop turned toward the Vox speaker. The Adeptus Arbites. He had logged the term from conversations in the corridor, cross-referenced it against context, and constructed a working definition: Imperial law enforcement. Heavy armor. Absolute authority. Answerable to the Emperor's law rather than local governance. Law enforcement. His own kind, in whatever sense that phrase applied here. Muggos Veth moved to his side with the speed of something that had replaced its legs with something faster than legs. The Arbites have no authority over Mechanicus property, it said, low and urgent. I'm not property, RoboCop said, with the same flat certainty he had used the first time someone from OCP had called him an asset. The Central Muggos raised one brass-fitted hand for silence and addressed the Vox. Arbitrator Signoris Draken, The subject is currently undergoing Mechanicus theological assessment. We will require 48 standard hours before any transfer discussion. You'll require nothing. Draken's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. I have a warrant of acquisition signed by Sector Judicial Command. My team is at your outer gate. Open it, or I open it. A long silence. The kind that precedes institutional capitulation. The blast door at the far end of the council chamber began, slowly, to open. RoboCop watched it move and felt something stir in the cognitive architecture that his designers had never fully managed to suppress. The part that was still, underneath everything, Alex Murphy. The part that had spent a career reading rooms and reading people and understanding. Before a single word was spoken, what kind of situation he was walking into. The Arbites were law enforcement. But the way the Mechanicus feared them was not the way civilians feared police. It was the way institutions feared other institutions, the recognition of a power that did not ask for permission and did not explain itself. He had worked for OCP. He knew what that felt like from the inside. The armored figures that entered the chamber wore black and gray, their faces hidden behind heavy helmets. Their weapons, long-barreled shotguns that is threat. Assessment classified as execution tools as readily as law enforcement. Tools, held at a carry that was one muscle. Movement from ready. At their head walked a figure whose armor bore the additional insignia of command, whose bearing communicated the absolute conviction of someone who had never once doubted that the law and their interpretation of it were identical things. Arbitrator Signoris. Draken stopped 10 feet from RoboCop and looked at him for a long time. Interesting, Draken said finally. The word carried no warmth. You're coming with me. RoboCop looked at the Arbites, at their weapons, at the particular quality of authority they projected, righteous, total, and completely uninterested in questions. He thought about what the Mechanicus Muggos had said, about laws that couldn't withstand scrutiny. I'll cooperate, he said. As he had said to the Magi, he meant it the same way he had meant it then, as a statement of present intent, not permanent submission. He followed Draken toward the gate, and the hive city opened around him for the first time, a vast, stacked civilization of 100 million souls, rising in tears from an underhive that never saw natural light to a spire that pierced the clouds. Every level bound by the same iron law, every citizen defined by their place within it. He began, immediately and automatically, to count the violations. High vaulties rose from the surface of Forgeway, secundus like a tumor that had learned architecture. From the transport vehicles, armored viewport, a slit of reinforced glass barely wide enough to qualify as a window. RoboCop cataloged its exterior as Draken's Arbites. Convoy moved from the Mechanicus sanctum toward the precinct fortress at the hive's mid-level. The structure defied the engineering vocabulary he carried. Buildings did not simply stack in high vaulties. They accumulated, each generation of construction pressing down on the last, the weight of centuries compressing the lower levels into a darkness that the upper tiers had forgotten existed. Pipes and cables ran down the exterior like exposed nerves. Smoke rose from 1,000 sources. The sky above was the color of an old bruise. Draken sat across from him in the transport, helmet removed now, studying him with the pale and methodical attention of someone who had spent a career separating truth from performance. She was perhaps 50, her face carrying the particular weathering of authority exercised in difficult places for a very long time. A scar ran from her left temple to her jawline. Not the ragged mark of an accident, but the clean line of an edged weapon. The kind that required an opponent skilled enough to get that close. You don't ask questions, she said. It wasn't quite an accusation. I'm gathering information first, RoboCop said. Questions are more useful when you have enough context to evaluate the answers. Something shifted in her expression, not approval. Precisely, but a recalibration. The Mechanicus filed you as a potential abominable intelligence. Ordo Hereticus will want you examined. That process is not comfortable. I've been examined before. Not by the Inquisition. He filed that term alongside Adeptus Arbites. Mechanicus, Imperium, a growing taxonomy of institutions whose relationships to each other and to the population they governed. He was still mapping. Is the Inquisition law enforcement? Draken's mouth formed something that wasn't quite a smile. The Inquisition is beyond law. They operate in the spaces where law cannot reach, or chooses not to look. A pause. I'm telling you this so you understand the situation you're in. I don't know what you are. I don't know where you came from. But you spoke to the Mechanicus. Counsel with an honesty that got their theological subroutines in a knot. And that is either very brave or very stupid. And I find I want to know which. It was neither, RoboCop said. It was accurate. Deception has operational costs I prefer to avoid. The transport stopped. Through the viewport, he could see the precinct fortress, a massive structure of black stone and reinforced plasteel, its facade decorated with aquilus, and scales of justice rendered in a style that communicated permanence, and the absolute indifference of institutional power. Arbites in full carapace armor stood at the gates. Citizens passing on the Hab Street beyond gave the precinct a berth that was not respect, but its functional cousin. The careful distance of people who had learned that proximity to law enforcement in this city was a variable best minimized. He watched a family cross the street to avoid walking within 20 meters of the gate. He had seen that before. In certain precincts, in certain eras of OCP's management of Detroit, he knew what it meant. They processed him into the precinct with the brisk efficiency of an institution that handled anomalies by forcing them into existing categories. He was logged as unclassified Xenos adjacent entity. Case reference VH 7741, which he noted was technically inaccurate but chose not to contest. They scanned him 3 times with instruments that glowed with a faint inner light and smelled of ozone and incense. They took his Auto 9. That, he contested. That weapon is my service firearm, he said, to the Arbite's processing officer who had reached for it with the casual confidence of someone who had never had the gesture refused. It remains in my custody. The officer looked at him, looked at Draken, who had followed them inside. It's logged as evidence, the officer said. It's my weapon. He did not raise his voice. He did not alter his posture. He simply did not move. And the officer discovered that, attempting to take something from a titanium alloy chassis required more force than a processing intake was designed to apply. I will not discharge it within this facility without cause. I will not use it against personnel who are not presenting a lethal threat. Those are the conditions under which I'll cooperate with your intake process. The weapon stays with me. A long pause. Draken, behind him, made no move to escalate. Log it as retained by subject. Draken said finally, to the officer. My authority. The officer logged it and moved on with the practiced expression of someone choosing their battles wisely. Draken led him to an interrogation room that was also, he assessed, a holding cell, the door locked from outside. The walls were thick enough to muffle sound in both directions, and the single table was bolted to the floor with fixtures rated for something considerably stronger than a standard human. He appreciated the thoroughness. I'm going to ask you direct questions, Draken said, sitting across from him. I want direct answers. That's my preference as well. She asked him about his origin, and he told her the same account he had given the Magi, with the same flat honesty. She asked about his capabilities, and he provided a specification summary that was accurate and complete. She asked about his directives. He recited them. Serve the public trust. Protect the innocent. Uphold the law. Draken was quiet for a moment after that. Those are the directives of this precinct, she said. Every Arbite's precinct. Written differently, but the same bones. I noticed. And the 4th directive? He looked at her. Classified. Her eyes narrowed slightly. By whom? By an authority that no longer exists in any universe. I currently have access to. He paused. It's a constraint, not a capability. It limits what I can do in specific circumstances. It doesn't present a threat to your personnel or your operations. She studied him for a long moment, with the focused attention of someone deciding whether a statement was true or merely plausible. Then she moved on. In 3 hours, she said, there is a public correction scheduled in the Civitas Plaza, Mid-Hive Level 7. A man named Orton Vall, a hab worker from Level 9, has been convicted of sedition against the Imperial Creed. The sentence is death by public execution. She watched his optical sensors carefully as she said it. He has 3 children. His crime was speaking in a private hab unit that was being monitored, words that questioned the Emperor's divinity. No violence. No conspiracy. No material action. Words, spoken privately, that a monitored servitor recorded and transmitted. RoboCop processed this for 1.3 seconds, a long time by his standards. That's not justice, he said. It's imperial law. Those aren't the same thing. The words landed in the room with the particular weight of statements that are simple and true, and, in the wrong context, catastrophic. Draken did not flinch. She had, he suspected, thought this herself, in the private hours that institutional loyalty didn't reach. But thinking it and saying it were different propositions, and saying it to an unclassified entity whose case file was already flagged for inquisitorial review was a different proposition still. No, she said quietly. They're not always the same thing. What happens if I'm present at this execution? You're in my custody. That's not what I asked. She stood up, moved to the door, paused with her hand on the frame, her back to him, in the posture of someone having a conversation with themselves that they weren't ready to have out loud. The plaza is 3 levels above us, she said. The transport routes pass through Corridor Junction H7. The holding lock on this room was designed for human detainees. Another pause. I need to consult with senior command about your classification status. That consultation will take approximately 40 minutes. She left, the door locked behind her. RoboCop sat in the silence of the room and ran a structural analysis of the holding lock with the patient attention of a being who had never once confused following orders with upholding the law. They were not the same thing. He had learned that lesson in Detroit. At a cost he still carried in whatever served him for a soul. 40 minutes was enough time. He stood up. Corridor Junction H7 connected the precinct fortress to the mid-hive transit arteries through a maintenance passage that smelled of recirculated air and promethium residue and the particular staleness of spaces that moved people without caring about them. RoboCop moved through it at a pace calibrated to arrive at Civitas Plaza with 3 minutes to spare. Enough time to assess the situation. Not enough time to be intercepted by anyone who had discovered the empty holding room and begun making calls. The plaza opened before him like a wound in the hive's dense architecture. A rare open space, 300 meters across, its floor worn smooth by the feet of generations who had gathered here to witness whatever the Imperium had decided they needed to see. Hab blocks rose on all sides, their lower windows crowded with faces. The population of several surrounding levels had been directed here. He could see Arbites in crowd control formation along the plaza's perimeter, their suppression mauls at the ready, their posture communicating that attendance was not precisely voluntary. At the plaza's center stood a raised platform. On it, a man knelt in chains. Orton Vall was younger than RoboCop had expected, perhaps 35, his face carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who had been in custody long enough for hope to become a distant memory. His clothing was the rough spun of a hab worker, stained and torn. His hands, bound behind him, were the hands of someone who had spent his life in physical labor. Beside him stood an Arbite's executioner in ceremonial black, a weapon that RoboCop's threat assessment classified as a bolt pistol held with the professional ease of someone who had performed this function before. Across the platform, an ecclesiarchy, priest in robes of red and gold, was reading from a text, the formal charges. RoboCop understood from context, rendered in the liturgical language of imperial religious law. The crowd was silent in the particular way of crowds that had learned. Silence was the safest available response. RoboCop walked through the perimeter cordon. The Arbite's officers he passed reacted in sequence, recognition, alarm, the rapid calculation of whether to intercept him, and then, in most cases, the particular paralysis that occurred when a titanium alloy enforcement platform moving with calm purpose presented itself as a problem whose solution required resources currently unavailable. 2 of them reached for their Vox beads. He was already past them. He walked up the platform steps and stood between Orton Vall and the executioner. The priest stopped reading. The plaza's silence deepened into something qualitatively different. Not the silence of compliance, but the silence of a collective breath held by 100,000 people who were watching. Something they had never seen before and did not yet have language for. The executioner looked at him, raised the bolt pistol. not in firing position, but in the way of someone establishing territorial priority. Step aside, the executioner said. This is an imperial sentence being carried out under the authority of. I've reviewed the charge, RoboCop said. His voice carried across the plaza without effort. His audio systems were built for crowd environments. Private speech, monitored without the subject's knowledge, containing no incitement to violence, no material conspiracy, no action of any kind. The sentence is death. He let that sit for exactly 2 seconds. That's not a sentence. That's an execution of thought. The priest found his voice. You interrupt an imperial proceeding. You are in violation of. Show me the evidence review. Show me the trial record. Show me the defense, representation, and the standard of proof required for conviction. He turned his optical sensors to the priest with the focused attention he had always given to people who invoked authority without being able to specify its content. In my jurisdiction, a man cannot be executed for words spoken privately in his own home without a burden of proof that a recorded conversation alone does not meet. This is not your jurisdiction, the executioner said. No, RoboCop agreed. It isn't. But that man is innocent of any crime I recognize as legitimate, and I am a law enforcement officer, and I will not stand aside while an innocent man is killed. He did not draw his auto 9. He stood there, present, immovable, a physical fact inserted between the sentence and its execution, and let the situation find its own shape. Below the platform, the Arbite's perimeter was reorganizing. He could see officers receiving orders through their Vox beads. The crowd control formation shifting from outward-facing to inward. Draken would know where he was by now. Sector Command would be contacted within minutes, possibly already had been. He had, conservatively, for minutes before this became a confrontation. He could not resolve through presence alone. He turned to Vol. The man was staring at him with the expression of someone who had stopped expecting anything and was now receiving something his mind couldn't immediately process. Can you walk? RoboCop asked. Vol blinked. The chains. RoboCop assessed the chain mechanism, standard Arbite's restraint. Magnetic lock, the release point accessible at the wrist cuffs. He found the release and applied exactly the right pressure in exactly the right place. The chains fell. Vol stood unsteadily and looked at his own free hands as if they belonged to someone else. What do I do? He whispered. Stay behind me, RoboCop said. Don't run. Running tells them you're fleeing. Walking tells them you're being escorted. He turned back to the crowd, to the reorganizing Arbites, to the plaza full of people who were very quietly watching, something they had never seen and would not soon forget. We're going to walk off this platform and through that crowd, and the crowd is going to let us. Because there are 100,000 people here watching, and the Arbites are not going to open fire into that crowd for one hab worker. He was calculating as he said it, probability assessment running at full capacity. The Arbites' rules of engagement in a crowd environment. The political cost of a mass casualty incident in a civilian plaza. The instinctive reluctance of officers trained for compliance rather than massacre. The numbers held. Barely, but they held. They walked off the platform. The crowd parted. Not dramatically, not with cheers or surging momentum. Quietly, in the manner of people making small individual decisions that collectively produced a path. A woman pulled her child back. A man shifted 2 steps to the left. An elderly laborer turned his body sideways to widen the gap. One by one, the 100,000 made room. And RoboCop walked Orton, Vol through the center of it with the steady pace of a process that had already been decided. The Arbites did not fire. They followed, at a distance that communicated intent without immediate action. The following of institutions calculating their next move while being watched by too many eyes to move rashly. RoboCop logged the route as he walked. The mid-hive transit arteries opened into residential hab blocks that opened into vertical transit shafts that descended into the levels below. The hive had geography he was only beginning to map, but the principles were familiar. Every city had places that authority reached and places that authority chose not to bother with. In Detroit, those places had been called the urban decay zones, the dead precincts, the areas where OCPs privatized. Police coverage didn't extend because coverage cost money, and there was no profit in protecting people who had none. He suspected Hive Voltes had the same calculus. He suspected it called those places the Underhive. He was right. By the time Draken's reinforced, Arbite's squad reached the plaza's far entrance. RoboCop and Vol had descended 2 transit levels and were moving through a corridor where the lighting had failed decades ago and no one had filed a maintenance order because the people who lived in the dark didn't have the administrative standing to file one. Vol stumbled in the darkness. RoboCop's optical sensors shifted to low-light enhancement without interrupting his stride. "Where are we going?" Vol asked. His voice had recovered something, not confidence yet, but the early architecture of it. "Down," RoboCop said, "until we find somewhere you can be safe." "Nowhere in the Hive is safe. Not now." Vol stopped. Swallowed. "They'll come for my family. My children. That's how it works. When someone runs, they take the family." RoboCop stopped walking. He processed this for 1.7 seconds, running faction behavior models. Consequence trees. The institutional logic of collective punishment as a compliance mechanism. He had seen variations of it before. It was always, he had found, the clearest possible signal that the law being enforced had abandoned its foundational purpose and become something else entirely. "Where is your family?" he asked. "Level 9, Vol said. Hab Block 7, Unit 44. "But you can't. The Arbites will already be." "Address confirmed," RoboCop said. He had already rerouted his internal map. "We're not going down. We're going to Level 9. He turned, and Vol followed him. And somewhere above them in the fortress of black stone and imperial certainty, Arbitrator Signoris. Draken stood in an empty holding room and looked at the broken lock and permitted herself one slow exhale before reaching for her Vox bead. "All units," she said. "Subject is mobile. He has the condemned." A pause that carried the weight of everything she hadn't said in the interrogation room. "Do not engage with lethal force. I repeat, do not engage with lethal force. I want him contained, not destroyed." Another pause, longer. "And someone find out where Vol's family lives before our subject does something that makes this situation considerably more complicated." She was, as it happened, already too late for that instruction. RoboCop was already on Level 9. Hab Block 7 on Level 9 was the kind of structure that had stopped being maintained. Around the same time the people living in it had stopped mattering to anyone with the authority to care. The walls were original, poured ferrocrete, from an era so distant that the construction marks had worn smooth, but everything applied to them since was improvised. Patch panels of scavenged metal, insulation made from compressed waste fiber, lighting strips pulled from decommissioned machinery and rewired by people who had learned electrical work from necessity rather than training. The corridor outside Unit 44 smelled of recycled water and cooking fat in the particular density of too many people in too little space. RoboCop arrived 40 seconds before the Arbites. He knew this because he could hear them. Boots on the transit shaft ladder 2 levels up. The specific cadence of armed officers moving fast, but not yet running. Vox communication on a frequency his systems had partially decoded. During the plaza withdrawal, they were close. Not close enough. He knocked on the door of Unit 44. A long pause. Then a child's voice, small and careful. "Who is it?" "My name is Murphy," he said. "I'm a police officer. Your father sent me." Another pause. Longer, the kind filled with internal deliberation that children performed. Faster and more honestly than adults. The door opened. 3 children. The oldest perhaps 12. A girl with her father's exhausted eyes already learning to carry adult weight. Behind her, 2 boys, 7 and 5 respectively. The younger one clutching the older one sleeve with the grip of a child who had understood from the atmosphere of the last several days that something was very wrong, without being told the specifics. Behind them all, a woman, late 30s, Vol's wife, her face carrying a grief that had been making its preparations for some time. She looked at RoboCop, looked at Vol, who had appeared at his shoulder, and made a sound that was not quite a word. Vol moved past RoboCop and gathered his family in the doorway, and RoboCop turned his back and faced the corridor, and gave them 30 seconds, which was all the operational timeline permitted. "We need to move," he said, without turning. The Arbites are 40 seconds out. Is there another exit from this unit? The woman, her name was Sarah, he learned in the next 3 minutes, answered with the practical speed of someone who had spent years in environments where knowing your exits was survival competence. There was a maintenance access behind the water recycling unit, connecting to a service corridor that ran the length of the hab block's interior. The service corridor connected to a vertical shaft that Arbites patrols used irregularly, on a schedule Sarah had memorized, because when you lived on level 9 you memorized Arbites patrol schedules the way people in safer places memorized weather patterns. They moved through the maintenance access as the knock came on the front door of Unit 44, the heavy, non-negotiable knock of institutional authority that had decided patience was no longer the relevant tool. The service corridor was dark and narrow, close enough that RoboCop's chassis scraped the walls at the shoulders. He moved through it anyway, filing the discomfort as irrelevant data. The family moved behind him, Sarah carrying the youngest boy, the girl holding the middle child's hand, Vol at the rear. They were quiet in the way of people who had learned that noise had consequences. He heard the Arbites breach the unit behind them, heard the professional efficiency of a search conducted by people who knew exactly what they were looking for and exactly what they would do when they found it. They didn't find anything. The shaft swallowed the family downward, and the darkness closed over them. And the level 9 hab block held its breath and let them go. The underhive began, properly, at level 14. Above 14, the hive maintained the infrastructure of legibility, numbered corridors, functioning transit, Arbites patrol routes, the administrative skeleton of a city that at least performed the motions of governance. Below 14, the skeleton gave way to something older and less organized, a sedimentary accumulation of everything the upper hive had discarded over centuries, compressed by weight and time, into a lightless ecosystem that operated according to its own entirely different rules. RoboCop walked into it and began, immediately, cataloging. Population, substantial. His thermal imaging resolved. Hundreds of heat signatures in the first 300 meters alone. Figures moving through spaces that had no official designation. Living in structures assembled from debris with an ingenuity born of absolute necessity. The architecture of the underhive was the architecture of survival. Every surface repurposed, every material extracted from its original function and pressed into a new one. Every space inhabited because empty space in the underhive was a resource too valuable to leave unused. There was commerce here. He could see it. Exchange of goods and currency happening in alcoves and at makeshift stalls. A market economy operating entirely outside whatever official systems the upper hive used. There were children. There were elderly people. There were individuals whose physical conditions indicated medical needs that had clearly not been addressed in a long time, because the underhive did not appear on any medical deployment schedule he could extrapolate from what he'd observed of the hive's official infrastructure. There was also violence. He logged 3 separate altercations in his first 10 minutes. 2 resolved before escalating. One that ended with a figure down and a second figure moving away fast. No one intervened. No authority responded. The underhive enforced itself through mechanisms he was still mapping. Vol knew people here. Former neighbors, he explained as they moved. Families who had descended from levels above when they could no longer afford the habtithe. Workers displaced by manufacturing automation. Individuals who had committed the administrative offense of failing to exist within the categories the upper hive recognized. The underhive was, in the functional sense that mattered to RoboCop's assessment, a city of people the Imperium had decided it could afford to forget. They found shelter in a space that had once been a Prometheum relay station, its tanks long dry, its equipment long stripped for parts, its walls still bearing faded operational markings that no one currently alive had the context to read. Sarah organized the children with the quiet efficiency of someone who had moved before under pressure and knew that children needed tasks to prevent the fear from becoming overwhelming. The youngest boy was given the job of counting ceiling rivets. He took it seriously. Vol sat against the wall and looked at RoboCop with the expression of someone assembling a question they weren't sure they had the right to ask. Why? He said finally. You didn't know me. You don't know this place. You had no reason to. Protect the innocent, RoboCop said. It was not a deflection. It was a complete answer. Vol absorbed this. The Arbites will search the Underhive. Yes. They'll send more than patrol squads. When someone interferes with an Imperial sentence, he stopped. Started again. You don't understand what you've done. What they'll send. Tell me. Vol told him. The picture that assembled was detailed and consistent with what RoboCop had already extrapolated, an institutional response that would escalate in proportion to the public nature of the disruption. The Arbites. Then, above the Arbites, the body Draken had mentioned in the interrogation room. The one that operated in the spaces where law chose not to look. The Inquisition. Before Vol finished speaking, RoboCop's audio sensors flagged an anomaly in the ambient sound of the Underhive, a change in the background texture of the place. Subtle but distinct. The commerce sounds had shifted. The movement patterns of the people he could track on thermal imaging had changed. Not the organized retreat of a population responding to a known threat. Something less legible than that. Something older. A woman appeared in the relay station's doorway. Underhive resident by her clothing and bearing. Perhaps 60, her eyes carrying the specific quality of someone who had survived long enough in this environment to develop reliable threat assessment of their own. She looked at RoboCop without the fear he had become accustomed to, with something closer to evaluation. You're the one from the plaza, she said. It was not a question. Yes. Word travels fast down here. She looked at the Vol family, at the children, with an expression that made a series of rapid, compassionate calculations. Then back to him. Something's moving in the deep Underhive. Below level 20. We've been feeling it for 3 days. Wrong sounds, wrong smells. People who went down to scavenge and didn't come back. She paused. It started around the time something tore open in the sky. Above the Mechanicus sanctum, RoboCop processed the timeline. The dimensional rupture that had brought him here. 3 days ago. What kind of something, he asked. The woman's jaw tightened. The kind that whispers, she said. The kind that makes promises. The kind that wears faces it borrowed from people we used to know. In the corner, the youngest Vol boy had stopped counting rivets. He was staring at the doorway behind the woman with the wide, glassy focus of a child hearing something the adults couldn't. There's a voice, the boy said quietly. It knows my name. RoboCop was already moving toward the deeper dark before the child finished speaking. His targeting systems coming online. His auto, 9 clearing its holster. With the smooth automation of a reflex that had survived the transition between universes intact. Whatever had followed him through the tear in reality, it had not been idle. The deep Underhive had its own geography, a stratigraphy of abandonment laid down in geological layers, each stratum representing an era when the hive above had grown too heavy for its own foundations and simply built over whatever it could no longer maintain. RoboCop moved through it with his low-light enhancement at maximum gain, his thermal imaging sweeping in overlapping arcs, his audio sensors filtering the ambient decay sounds of ancient infrastructure for anything that didn't belong. He found the first body at level 17. A scavenger, male, perhaps 30. The cause of death was not immediately consistent with any weapon in his current threat database. No projectile trauma, no blade wound, no burn pattern. The man had simply stopped in the middle of a corridor, and whatever had animated him had departed with a thoroughness that left the biology intact and entirely empty. His face was arranged in an expression that RoboCop's pattern recognition flagged as inconsistent with pain or fear or any of the standard terminal emotional states. It was closer to wonder, the specific wonder of someone who had been shown something extraordinary in the last moments of their life. He documented it, moved on. The second body was at level 18. A woman, same presentation. Third was a child, which he documented with the same procedural efficiency, and filed in a separate category that had no official designation in his operating parameters but existed nonetheless. In the part of his architecture, that was still Alex Murphy and had never fully accepted that procedural efficiency was an adequate response to a dead child. The whispers began at level 19. Not whispers exactly. His audio sensors were precise enough to characterize the phenomenon more accurately than that word implied. It was sound operating at the boundary of human auditory range, fluctuating in and out of perceptibility, structured in patterns that his linguistic processors kept attempting to parse and kept failing to resolve into meaning. Not because the content was meaningless, because his systems were recognizing it as language and simultaneously flagging the language as something that predated every linguistic database he carried, something that had been spoken before the concepts his databases were built on had existed. His targeting reticle activated without conscious direction. Old reflex. Good reflex. At level 19, he found the congregation. 40, perhaps 50 Underhive residents, gathered in what had once been a water processing facility, its tanks still present, dry and vast, their interior surfaces now covered in markings that his optical sensors recorded faithfully, and his pattern recognition declined to classify. The markings moved, not in the manner of mechanical movement, but in the manner of something that had been given the appearance of stillness and was maintaining it with effort. The congregation faced the far tank. Inside the tank, elevated on a platform of debris, assembled with the particular intentionality of an altar, stood a figure that RoboCop sensors gave him contradictory readings on. Thermal imaging suggested a human heat signature. Structural analysis suggested bone density and mass inconsistent with the human baseline. The electromagnetic reading was something his instruments registered and then, for 0.3 seconds, refused to display, a gap in his sensor record. That had never occurred before, and that his diagnostics could not explain. The figure was speaking. Its voice was the source of the subauditory pattern he had been tracking. He could see that now. The sound emanating not just from the figure's mouth, but from its entire surface, from the markings on the walls, from some collaborative resonance between the speaker and the space. And the congregation was listening with the rapt, emptied attention of people who had been offered something they had wanted for a very long time. RoboCop had encountered cults in Detroit. The operational principle was consistent across contexts: find people in sufficient pain, offer them meaning and belonging, and the promise that their suffering was purposeful, secure their loyalty before they had recovered enough equilibrium to evaluate what they had agreed to. The mechanism was predatory regardless of the doctrine. The doctrine here was something he couldn't parse, but the mechanism he recognized immediately. He stepped into the water processing facility and his targeting system locked on the figure in the tank. Step away from these people, he said. The congregation turned. 40 faces, and in each one the same quality he had seen on the dead scavenger at level 17. Not fear, not anger, but the specific expression of people whose threshold for wonder had been comprehensively recalibrated. Behind their eyes, something was doing the math on whether he was a threat or an opportunity. The figure in the tank turned last. It had been a man once. He could see the original architecture still present. The way the face retained its human geometry even as something had been added to it, layered over it, moving beneath the surface of it like water beneath ice. It looked at him with eyes that had too much depth, eyes that seemed to extend further back than the skull they were set in should have permitted. The machine that remembers, it said. Its voice arrived in his audio processors at multiple frequencies simultaneously, some of them in ranges that should have required equipment he didn't possess to detect. We felt you arrive. The tear you came through, it left a resonance. A door slightly ajar. Something that might have been a smile. We are grateful for it. You came through the dimensional rupture, RoboCop said. He was processing rapidly, cross-referencing what Vol's wife had said about 3 days. What the Underhive woman had said about wrong sounds and borrowed faces. What his sensor gap at the moment of direct observation implied about the nature of what he was dealing with. You followed me. We were already adjacent, the figure said pleasantly. You simply provided the mechanism. The warp is always present, machine that remembers. It exists in the spaces between your certainties. Your universe has laws. We find laws so beautifully fragile. It tilted its head at an angle that exceeded the range of motion a human cervical spine permitted. These people called to us, not in words. In what? In the accumulated weight of lives that your Imperium has rendered invisible. A gesture toward the congregation. We simply answered. You're killing them, RoboCop said. The bodies at levels 17 and 18 were evidence. He had already logged. We are changing them, the figure corrected. Some changes are more comprehensive than others. The process is not without cost. No apology in its voice. The same tone a corporation used when discussing acceptable losses. He knew that tone. He had learned to hate it at a molecular level. He raised the auto 9. The figure looked at the weapon with academic interest. You propose to shoot us. I propose to give you one opportunity to release these people and withdraw. After that, yes. We are not fully present in your physical space, machine that remembers. Your weapon addresses matter. We are not entirely matter. It paused. But you knew that. You are still raising it. Interesting. The depth behind its eyes shifted. Something moving in those recesses, reassessing. Why? Because sometimes you raise the weapon because it's the right thing to do. Not because it's guaranteed to work, RoboCop said. He fired. The auto 9 discharged 3 rounds in a grouping that his targeting computer had calculated as optimal for a target of the figure's mass and position. The round struck. The figure came apart in a manner that was simultaneously physical and not, the material component of it, staggering, falling, the something else component of it, scattering through the facility in a wave of subauditory sound that hit his sensors like feedback and briefly scrambled his targeting reticle. The congregation collapsed. Not dead, he checked immediately, moving through them with his medical assessment protocols running, but released. The emptied quality departing their faces as if a current had been cut, leaving them disoriented and frightened and present in a way they hadn't been 30 seconds ago. The markings on the walls faded. Not all the way. Traces remained. The way bruises remained after the force that caused them was gone. The something else that had vacated the figure was not gone. He could feel that, a new operational category, requiring new assessment frameworks. His sensors tracked it withdrawing deeper into the hive rather than upward. Not fleeing. Regrouping. He was helping the congregation to their feet, running triage assessment when the light changed. Not the underhive's standard failing illumination. A new source, cold and directionless, emanating from figures who had descended the transit shaft behind him with the particular silence of people who had extensive practice arriving undetected. He turned. 7 individuals in non-standard armor, lighter than Arbite's carapace, less ceremonial than the Mechanicus's aesthetic, bearing no insignia that his pattern recognition could place. At their center, a figure whose bearing communicated authority, of a different category than Draken's, not institutional authority, not the authority of a position within a hierarchy, but the authority of someone who had been given a mandate so broad that hierarchy itself was beneath it. The figure was perhaps 45 angular features, eyes that performed the same rapid assessment of him that he was performing of them. Professional, thorough, arriving at conclusions in real time. You shot a demon, the figure said. Flat observation, not quite surprise. I shot something that was killing people, RoboCop said. What I shot it with is open to interpretation. An auto 9 pattern weapon. The figure moved closer, studying him with the focused interest of someone whose entire career was the investigation of impossible things. Conventional ammunition. No blessed rounds. No PSYK out grenades. No sanctified ordnance. A pause. And it worked. Partially, RoboCop said. It's regrouping below level 20. Yes. The figure stopped 3 meters away. Close enough for direct conversation. Far enough to be outside the range at which RoboCop's threat assessment would have required a response. Careful. Experienced. My name is Inquisitor. Valdres Thane. Ordo Malleus. A beat. You are the entity the Arbites have been attempting to locate. The one who interrupted the execution in Civitas Plaza. Murphy, RoboCop said. Alex Murphy. Thane looked at him for a long moment with the expression of someone updating a very complex internal model. Murphy, he repeated. I have approximately 40 questions for you. The most urgent one is this: the resonance signature of the rupture that brought you here matches the warp signature of what you just shot. He gestured toward the space the figure had occupied, which means whatever that thing is, it arrived the same way you did. His eyes sharpened. Did you bring it with you? Or did it bring you? The question landed in RoboCop's processing architecture and stayed there, unresolved. radiating implications in every direction. He didn't have an answer. That, in his experience, was when situations became genuinely dangerous. The Inquisitor's name was Valdris Kale, Ordo Hereticus, and he moved through the Generatorum with the particular economy of someone who had learned long ago that unnecessary motion in the presence of a demon was an invitation. His retinue spread into tactical positions with practiced efficiency. 2 warrior acolytes flanking left, a hooded figure whose eyes glowed with the faint luminescence of active psychic ability taking a position at Kale's shoulder, and 4 more armed figures establishing a perimeter that enclosed the demon, the compelled residents, and RoboCop within the same operational boundary. RoboCop noted the boundary. He noted that it enclosed him. Kale stopped 6 meters from the demon and studied it with the focused attention of a professional who had seen this specific category of problem before and was running a rapid inventory of which solutions applied. Then he turned the same attention to RoboCop, and the quality of his assessment shifted from the recognition of a known problem to the more careful evaluation of an unknown variable. "You're the anomaly from the Mechanicus Sanctum," Kale said. It was not a question. "Murphy," RoboCop said. "Alex Murphy." Inquisitor Kale. He did not extend a hand. His eyes moved to the Auto 9, to the scorch mark on the turbine housing, to the demon which was holding itself very still in the manner of something recalculating its options. "You fired on it." Warning shot. Establishing credible threat with non-sanctified ammunition against a warp entity. Kale's tone was the tone of someone updating a model in real time, and it worked sufficiently. Kale looked at the demon again. Slaneshi in origin, if I'm reading its resonance correctly. Minor entity, significant enough for sustained manifestation, not significant enough for the higher rites of banishment. He glanced at his psyker acolyte, who gave a small confirming nod. It's been feeding on the emotional suffering of the underhive population. 3 days of accumulation. Back to RoboCop. "You said release them. You were attempting to negotiate their release before I arrived." "Yes. Why not simply destroy it?" "I didn't have confirmed data on what destroying it would do to the people in the circle. In an unfamiliar environment, with unknown variables, the option that preserves life takes priority over the option that eliminates threat." Kale was quiet for 2 seconds, a long time, RoboCop had learned. For a man whose mind appeared to operate at the speed of someone who had survived 30 years of the Imperium's most dangerous work by being faster than the problems he faced. "That is," Kale said carefully, "a remarkably sane operational principle." The demon chose this moment to reassert itself. It shed the borrowed face, dropped it the way a coat is shrugged off, the human shape dissolving into something that occupied the same space differently, larger in ways that didn't correspond to the room's geometry, its outline shifting between states as if it couldn't decide which form of wrongness it preferred. The compelled residents in the circle swayed collectively, their compliance deepening as the entity abandoned subtlety and reached directly into whatever psychic mechanisms it used to maintain its hold. Kale raised his hand. The psyker acolyte stepped forward, eyes blazing white, and the air between them and the demon developed a quality. RoboCop sensors, classified as electromagnetic, but which he understood was something his instruments weren't built to measure accurately. "Murphy," Kale said, his voice steady in the manner of someone conducting 2 operations simultaneously. "The residents. Get them out of the circle. The psychic hold weakens at the perimeter. Physical contact and movement should break individual compulsion if you're fast enough." RoboCop was already moving. He entered the circle from the south, where the entity's attention was least concentrated, and made contact with the nearest resident, a middle-aged man whose thermal imaging showed the elevated cortisol profile of someone being held in sustained neurological stress. He took the man's arm and moved him firmly and directly toward the Generatorum's corridor entrance. The man resisted for 1.1 seconds, the compulsion fighting the physical reality of being relocated, and then something released in his eyes, and he stumbled and looked around with the disorientation of someone waking in an unfamiliar place. "Move toward the corridor," RoboCop said. "Don't look at the center of the room. Keep moving." He went back for the next one. The demon screamed, a sound on frequencies that made the turbine housings resonate and caused three of Kale's acolytes to stagger. It directed its attention toward RoboCop, and he felt it, not as pain, not as fear, but as a pressure against his cognitive architecture, something searching for the emotional levers that it used to operate, biological beings and finding, in the systematic structure of his mind, fewer purchase points than it expected. It found grief. It found Murphy. It found the parking structure in Old Detroit and the men who had ended Alex Murphy's life in a series of calculated acts of violence. And it pressed on those memories, with the focused intent of a being that had learned to use what it found. He kept moving. He extracted the second resident and the third, his pace uninterrupted, his targeting systems maintaining a continuous lock on the demon, while his motor functions performed the extractions. The grief was real. The memories were real. They had always been real, and he had learned, in the years since his reconstruction, that real things did not require response. They required acknowledgement and continuance. He was Alex Murphy. Alex Murphy had died doing his job. RoboCop was what had continued. Continuing was the point. He extracted the fourth resident. The fifth. Behind him, Kale and the Psyker were conducting the banishment, an elaborate procedure involving chanted text in a language that predated the Imperium and a focused psychic assault that the Psyker acolyte was delivering, with the strained concentration of someone operating at their limit. The demon was fighting it. The generatorum shook. Dust fell from the ancient ceiling and curtains. By the time RoboCop extracted the 30th resident and walked them firmly to the corridor entrance, the banishment was in its final phase, the entity's form collapsing inward, its screaming dropping below audible range and then below sensor range. The cold patches in the ferrocrete walls warming, as the energy it had been drawing inward, released and dissipated. The compelled residents stood in the corridor in various states of recovering consciousness, supporting each other with the instinctive mutual assistance of people returning from somewhere they couldn't quite describe. The generatorum was quiet. Kale walked to RoboCop and stood beside him, looking at the space where the demon had been, which was now just a floor. 30 extractions, Kale said, under active psychic assault, while maintaining targeting lock. A pause. I've worked with Space Marines who would have found that challenging. The assault found emotional leverage points, RoboCop said. They were insufficient to interrupt motor function. Kale looked at him sideways. You felt it? Yes. And I kept moving. He holstered the Auto 9. The residents need medical assessment. Several are showing neurological stress profiles that will require monitoring. Do you have medical capability in your retinue? Kale studied him for a long moment with the expression of someone revising a document they thought they had finished. Yes, he said. I do. He turned toward his acolytes and issued instructions with the brisk efficiency of command. Then he turned back. We need to talk, Murphy, about what you are, where you came from, and what I'm going to do about both. I'm aware, RoboCop said. You disrupted a public imperial execution. You broke custody from an Arbeits detention facility. You've been harboring a condemned man and his family. Kale's voice was level, not threatening, precisely, but mapping the territory accurately. By the letter of imperial law, I should be apprehending you right now. By the letter of imperial law, RoboCop said. Orton Vall should be dead for a private conversation in his own home. The silence that followed was the silence of a man who had spent 30 years operating inside a system that he served with genuine conviction and genuine reservations in approximately equal measure, and who had just heard his own reservations stated plainly by something that had no political reason to be careful about it. Come with me, Kale said finally. Not as a prisoner. As a person, I need to understand better before I decide what the Imperium needs to do with you. He paused. Bring Vall's family. I know where they are. RoboCop filed this, that Kale had located the relay station, had chosen not to act on that information before entering the generatorum, had made a sequencing decision that prioritized the demon threat and said something about his operational priorities that the letter of his authority did not fully capture. There's a Space Marine kill team on this hive world, Kale said as they walked toward the corridor. Crimson Fists. They arrived 6 hours ago. ostensibly to assist with the inquisitorial assessment of the Mechanicus anomaly, which means you. Their sergeant has been asking questions about the plaza incident that go beyond tactical curiosity. A pause. I mention this because they're going to find you before long. In space, Marines are considerably less inclined toward nuanced conversation than I am. Understood, RoboCop said. One more thing. Kale stopped at the corridor entrance and looked at him with the direct, undecorated attention of someone asking a question they actually needed answered. The demon found your emotional architecture and used it against you. What did it find? RoboCop was quiet for a moment. A parking structure, he said. Old Detroit. It found the men who killed me. Kale absorbed this without visible reaction. The practiced reception of difficult information that was the mark of a man who had heard a great many difficult things and understood that his response to them mattered. And you kept moving, Kale said. That's the job, RoboCop said. They walked into the corridor, and the ancient dark of the deep underhive closed behind them. And somewhere above, in the inhabited levels of hive vaulties, a kill team of Crimson Fists was reading a report about a metal man who had walked out of an imperial execution with the condemned under his arm, and their sergeant was sitting with the report in his hands and feeling something he had not felt in a very long time, something that his centuries of service had compressed into a small hard thing kept behind the wall of duty, something that the report was now pressing against from the other side. The sergeant's name was Cortez. He had taken oaths once, before the processes that made him what he was. He remembered the content of those oaths very clearly. He set down the report and began putting on his armor. Kale's operational base and hive vaulties occupied a commandeered administratum building on level 11, far enough above the underhive to maintain communications with sector command, far enough below the spire to avoid the political visibility that came with proximity to the hive's governing elite. It was the kind of location chosen by someone who had learned that the most effective position was one that nobody thought to look at twice. RoboCop assessed it on entry, for exits, vantage points on all approach corridors, a Vox array capable of reaching orbit, and a Medicae station where Kale's retinue physician was already beginning assessment of the underhive residents they had brought up from the Generatorum. Vol's family had been retrieved from the relay station by two of Kale's acolytes, efficiently and without incident, which told him that Kale's people were practiced at moving civilians through hostile environments without attracting attention. Sarah Vol had looked at RoboCop when she arrived, with her children around her and her husband beside her, and had said nothing. The quality of her silence was the quality of someone who had accumulated a debt they did not yet have the vocabulary to acknowledge. He had filed it and moved on. Kale spread a hololithic map of the hive across the central table, a three-dimensional rendering of all 30-plus levels, the transit arteries between them, the locations of Arbite's patrol routes, Mechanicus' sanctum boundaries, and what appeared to be Kale's own surveillance notations marked in red. He studied it with the focused attention of someone managing multiple problems simultaneously. The Mechanicus situation first, he said, without looking up. Mugos Veth has filed a formal claim of Omnisia's relic on your person. This means the Adeptus Mechanicus is asserting that you are sacred, property of the machine, God, and must be delivered to Mars for study. He paused. This claim has no merit under imperial law as it currently applies to sentient beings, but the Mechanicus interprets the distinction between sentient being and sacred mechanism differently than the Lex Imperialis, and they have enough institutional weight to make the argument uncomfortable. He looked up. They're coming for you. Not Veth alone. She's filed with Forge World Command. A Skitarii cohort is en route. Estimated arrival, 18 hours. RoboCop processed this. And the Arbites. Arbitrator Signoris. Draken has filed a formal protest against my assumption of jurisdiction, which is standard procedure and which she knows will accomplish nothing. She's also quietly pulled her officers back from the underhive search perimeter. Kale's expression carried a specific neutrality that suggested he found Draken's choices professionally interesting. She's making room. I don't know if she's making room for me or for you. Both, possibly, RoboCop said. Kale looked at him. You read her the same way I did. She knows the system she operates is imperfect. She operates it anyway because imperfect law is better than none. I've worked with people like that. Have you? In Detroit, law enforcement was privatized, administered by a corporation with profit motives. The officers who stayed believed the alternative was worse. He paused. Some of them were right. Some of them used that belief to avoid examining what they were actually doing. Kill was quiet for a moment. And Draken? Draken left a door open, RoboCop said. Literally. Before Kale could respond, the Vox array activated with the particular tone of a priority transmission, overriding standard channels. The voice that came through was not Sector Command and was not the Mechanicus. It was deep, resonant, and carried the specific compression of a Vox system designed to transmit, through the acoustic, interference of power armor. Inquisitor Kale, Sergeant Cortez of the Crimson Fists did not waste words on preamble. I'm outside your position with my kill team. We're coming in. I suggest you open the door. Kale closed his eyes for exactly 1 second, the expression of a man adding a variable to an equation that was already complex. Then he nodded to the acolyte at the entrance controls. The door opened. Cortez entered first, which RoboCop noted as the behavior of a commander who did not send his soldiers into spaces he hadn't personally cleared. He was enormous in the way that post-human engineering produced. Not merely large, but fundamentally restructured. Every proportion recalibrated by the processes that had made him a space marine. His Crimson Fists armor, bearing the marks of centuries of service in the controlled damage of repaired ceramite and the deliberate preservation of honorable scarring. For more Crimson Fists filed in behind him, their presence reducing the available space in the administratum, building to a navigational challenge. Cortez looked at RoboCop. He looked at him for a long time, the sustained, unblinking assessment of someone, running a comparison against an internal reference point that he hadn't accessed in a while, and was now retrieving with careful attention. You pulled 30 people out of a demon's psychic hold, Cortez said, while under active assault, while maintaining weapons lock. Alone. The Inquisitor's retinue handled the banishment, RoboCop said. You extracted 30 civilians, Cortez repeated, with the emphasis of someone for whom the specific detail mattered, not the tactical achievement. The civilians. That was the priority. Cortez turned to Kale. I've read the Plaza report. He intervened in an imperial execution to protect a man convicted of thought crime. He did, Kale confirmed. He broke Arbite's custody. Also accurate. He has been operating in the Underhive, providing direct protection to the civilian population for. Cortez checked something on his armor's internal display. Approximately 11 hours since the Plaza incident. Your arithmetic is correct, Sergeant. Cortez turned back to RoboCop. When he spoke again, something had shifted in his register, not softer, precisely, but differently weighted. I took oaths, he said. When I was inducted, before the processes, I took oaths about why we fight, what we protect. A pause. Those oaths have become complicated over the years. The Imperium requires things that the oaths, read plainly, do not endorse. He looked at his gauntlet hands, a gesture so briefly human that it lasted less than a second before the ceramite closed again. You read the oaths plainly. I read the law plainly, RoboCop said. I found it's the only way to read it that doesn't eventually bend it into something else. The room was quiet except for the distant sounds of the Medicae station, where the Underhive residents were being treated. Then the Vox array activated again. And this time it was Sector Command. And this time the message was not a request. The Skitarii cohort's timeline had accelerated. 12 hours, not 18. Forge World Command had authorized emergency transit, which meant the Mechanicus had resources and urgency RoboCop hadn't fully accounted for. Additionally, a formal Mechanicus complaint had been filed with the sector governor's office, citing the Inquisitors' interference with a legitimate relic claim and demanding military support for the recovery operation. Kale listened to the message with the expression of someone watching a problem he had been managing carefully accelerate past the management threshold. They're going to bring an electro-priest congregation, his tech acolyte said, studying the transmission data. Fulgurite, possibly Corpuscarii, and the Skitarii cohort is armed for heavy retrieval. A pause. They mean to take him apart, Inquisitor. Study him in pieces. I'm aware of what they mean, Kale said. Cortez had been listening. He looked at RoboCop with the expression of a man arriving at a decision that several centuries of complicated service had been building toward, without his fully recognizing it. My kill team is on this world under inquisitorial secondment, he said to Kale. You have authority to redirect our operational parameters. I do, Kale agreed carefully. Then redirect them. Cortez's voice carried the particular finality of someone who had located after a long time the place where a line existed and was now standing on the correct side of it. We didn't come to this hive to help the Mechanicus dismantle a being that's been its first day here, pulling civilians out of demon holds and walking condemned men out of public executions. Kale looked at him for a moment, then at RoboCop, then at the hololithic map with its red notations and its Skitarii approach vectors and its 18-hour window that had just become 12. The Mechanicus cohort will enter through the mid-hive transit arteries, Kale said, shifting into operational mode with the clean transition of someone for whom thinking and planning were the same process. They'll expect their target to be stationary. The Inquisition holding an anomaly for examination, standard protocol. We give them that expectation. He looked at RoboCop, which means you need to not be here. The Underhive, RoboCop said. The Underhive, Kale confirmed. You know it better than they do now? You have contacts there. He paused. And there's something else. My psyker has been reading the residual warp energy from the demon's manifestation. The tear that brought you here. It's still active. Partially. Not enough to send you back, but enough that something else could come through. He met RoboCop's optical sensors directly. The demon we banished was minor. What follows minor manifestations, in my experience, is not minor. RoboCop processed this. You need me in the Underhive, because that's where the tear is weakest, and where another incursion is most likely. I need you in the Underhive, Kale said, because that's where you've already demonstrated you function most effectively, and because the people down there have approximately no other protection, and because a Skitarii cohort following you into the deep levels is a Skitarii cohort that isn't burning the inhabited levels, looking for you. A pause. And yes, because the tear. RoboCop looked at the map, at the Vol family in the Medici station, at Cortez and his kill team filling the room, with the presence of beings built for war who had just chosen, for reasons that had nothing to do with tactics, which direction to point themselves. Seth, he said. Kale raised an eyebrow. The Underhive woman who found me. She has knowledge of the deep levels I don't have yet. I need her included in whatever operational structure you're building. Kale made a note. Done. RoboCop looked at the map one more time. 12 hours. A Skitarii cohort. A dimensional tear in the deep Underhive that had already produced one demon and was apparently prepared to produce something larger. He thought about what the Muggos had asked him in the forge chamber. What are you? He thought about what the demon had found in his emotional architecture. Old Detroit, a parking structure. The men who had ended Alex Murphy. He thought about Ortonval's children, and the youngest one counting ceiling rivets. He was a police officer. He was operating without jurisdiction in a universe that had never heard of a police officer who meant it. He was a dead man in a titanium body in a galaxy that had been at war with itself for 10,000 years. The job was the same anyway. I'll need ammunition resupply, he said. Whatever your armorer has that approximates a 9mm round. Cortez reached into a compartment on his armor and produced a handful of bolt rounds that were approximately the wrong size and approximately the right principle. We'll make it work, the Space Marine said. The tear announced itself to his sensors at level 27. Not the subtle wrongness of the demon's peripheral influence, but something structural, a wound in the geometry of the space itself that his instruments measured in contradictions, temperature readings that inverted between scans, electromagnetic signatures that arrived before their sources. The ferrocrete walls at the tier's immediate proximity had developed a quality his optical sensors classified as translucent, not in the visual spectrum, but in some other dimension of perception that his systems were not designed to measure and were measuring anyway, in the way that instruments pushed beyond their operational parameters. sometimes produce data that is more accurate than their specifications should allow. He had been in the deep underhive for 4 hours. Seth moved beside him with the practiced silence of someone who had spent decades learning to exist in spaces that punished noise. She had accepted his operational briefing with the compressed, efficient reception of someone for whom situation assessments were survival currency. She processed information the way he did, he had noticed, by extracting what was immediately actionable and filing the rest without letting it slow her down. Behind them, maintaining the distance of beings who understood that their physical scale was a navigational liability in the deep underhives. Cramped corridors. Two of Cortez's crimson fists moved with the careful deliberateness of post-human soldiers exercising restraint. Cortez himself was on level 20 with the remaining kill team members, holding the approach corridor against the Skitarii cohort that had entered the hive 40 minutes ahead of schedule. 12 hours had become 8, and 8 had become 4, which Kale had assessed as evidence of Forge World Command applying resources that exceeded a standard retrieval operation. The Mechanicus wanted him very badly. The thought that they wanted him badly enough to accelerate a Skitarii deployment by 8 hours was information RoboCop had filed in the category of things that clarified a situation without improving it. Kale was on level 15, managing the institutional negotiation, formal, inquisitorial counterclaims against the Mechanicus relic designation. Vox traffic to Sector Command. That was buying hours. Through the reliable bureaucratic friction of competing imperial authorities disputing jurisdiction. It was, Kale had explained, with the dry precision of someone who had used this tool many times. A process that could delay a Skitarii cohort indefinitely or for 40 minutes, depending on factors impossible to predict in advance. So far, 40 minutes. The clock was running. Here, Seth said. The corridor opened into what had once been a primary water reclamation facility, a vast underground cistern, its original function long defunct, its enormous basin dry and cracked, its ceiling a cathedral of pipes and conduits that had stopped carrying anything decades ago. The space was perhaps 300 meters in diameter and 20 meters high, and in its center, the tear was visible, not to unaugmented eyes. Seth was looking at him rather than at the space above the cistern floor, reading his reaction to confirm what she could feel but not see, a pressure change, a subsonic vibration, the particular quality of wrongness that the Underhive's long-term residents had learned to identify through accumulated exposure. To his sensors, it was explicit. A vertical distortion in space approximately 4 meters high and 2 meters wide, its edges oscillating between states in a cycle that his systems calculated at 3.7 seconds, and through it, the faint and terrible suggestion of something beyond. Not his universe, not the warp, something in between, the space his transit had crossed, the non-space of dimensional travel that had carried him here and had not, apparently, fully closed behind him. He approached it slowly, his sensors running continuous analysis. The transit data he had collected on arrival, filed in his buffer memory, incomplete but present, matched the tier's dimensional signature with 73% correlation. Enough to confirm origin, not enough to confirm that anything he could do would reverse the process. The demon's residual energy was concentrated here. He could read it in the local warp field distortions his sensors had learned over 4 hours of underhive operation to partially interpret. The minor entity had been feeding from the tear as well as from the underhive population, drawing sustenance from both the suffering above and the dimensional instability below, which meant the tear had been the anchor point for its manifestation, which meant the tear was not accidental. Something had opened it from the other side. He was still processing this revision when the tear expanded, not violently, not the explosive rupture he had been modeling as the primary risk. It expanded with the slow, deliberate quality of something being opened from the other side by a being that was taking its time, that was confident in its approach, that had no particular reason to hurry because what it was stepping into was not capable of posing a meaningful threat. What came through was not minor. It occupied the cistern the way large things occupied spaces by making the space redefine itself around them. It was corporeal in the way that Things that chose to be corporeal were corporeal, wearing a physical form because physical forms were useful in physical spaces, not because physicality was its natural state. His sensors classified it as demonic in origin, sentient in aspect based on the geometric complexity of its visual signature and the fact that it arrived already, speaking in a voice that operated on 17 frequencies simultaneously and was constructing elaborate logical frameworks in each of them at once. It looked at him with eyes that contained too many angles, and it said his name, not Murphy, not RoboCop, but the name that Alex Murphy had been called as a child, in a house in Detroit that he had not thought about in years, by people who should have been unknowable to anything in this universe. His targeting system locked. His auto 9 cleared its holster. "You've been watching the tear," he said. "Since you arrived," the demon said, in 17 frequencies, constructing something that was almost a smile. "We felt you cross. A machine soul from outside the warp's reach. Do you understand how rare that is? How interesting." It moved through the cistern, with the fluid wrongness of something that experienced space differently than matter did. "The lesser one we sent first was a test. You passed it more thoroughly than anticipated. You sent the Slaneshi entity. An investment. We needed to understand how you function, what you prioritize, what you feel." It paused. "You feel more than you present. The parking structure, the men, the moment that ended Alex Murphy and began this." A gesture that encompassed his chassis with something that was not quite contempt and not quite admiration, but contained elements of both. "We can give him back to you. Murphy is here," RoboCop said. "He's been here the whole time. The memory of him, the ghost of him. We can give you the living man, restored, whole." The demon's voice found its way into the frequencies below conscious hearing, resonating against the architecture of grief that the Slaneshi entity had mapped and transmitted before its banishment. "All we require is access. The machine soul outside the warp's reach, freely given. Do you understand what that's worth to us? No corruption, no erosion. A mind that operates in this universe without the warp's fingerprints on it. You would be." "No," RoboCop said. The demon paused. In 17 frequencies simultaneously. The pause had 17 different qualities. "You haven't considered." "I considered it in the time it took you to make the offer," RoboCop said. "You're describing a transaction in which I give you something of operational value in exchange for something I want. The thing I want doesn't exist anymore. Alex Murphy is what I am now. What I was before is gone. And no demon in any universe gets to tell me that's a wound worth exploiting." His targeting system painted the demon's primary mass. "And I don't make deals with things that send other things to harvest suffering from people who have nothing." The demon attacked. It attacked the way its ancient entities attacked, not directly, because direct was a concept for beings with less imagination, but through the space around him, folding the cistern's geometry to put itself in positions. His targeting system had to continuously recalculate, striking with energy that his armor absorbed and controlled increments while his sensors mapped the attack patterns, and his tactical processing found the iterative logic underneath them. Because there was logic, even sentient chaos operated on patterns, fractal, recursive, self-similar at different scales. But patterns. He had been a detective before he was a soldier. He had spent a career finding patterns in the behavior of things that didn't want to be found. He found it on the fourth exchange, a 3.7-second cycle, the same interval as the tear's oscillation, the demon synchronizing its movement to the dimensional frequency it had used to enter. Predictable. Not immediately, not obviously, but predictable. He fired on the tear, not on the demon, on the tear itself, at the moment of the cycle's peak. His auto 9 putting rounds, through the dimensional aperture at angles, calculated to disrupt the oscillation frequency. The Skitarii adjacent ammunition Cortez's armorer had improvised carried more kinetic energy than standard 9mm, and kinetic energy, he had established earlier, was a universal argument. The tear contracted. The demon screamed in 17 frequencies and wheeled toward the tear, toward the closing exit. And in the moment of its distraction, Seth was already moving. She had been moving for 30 seconds. He realized, circling wide while he engaged. reaching the positions he had identified and communicated to her through hand signals during the demon's monologue, because the demon had been talking and he had been planning, and the gap between those two activities was the gap he had been waiting for. She activated the device Kale had given her, an inquisitorial-grade psychic disruptor, compact, designed for exactly this, not banishment, not destruction, but disruption. A 2-second window of psychic interference that broke the warp entities. Coherence the way a static burst broke a Vox signal. 2 seconds was enough. RoboCop crossed the cistern in those 2 seconds at full speed, closing with the demon while its coherence flickered, his Auto-9 firing in continuous controlled bursts at its primary mass. Not to destroy it, because he understood now that destruction was Kale's tool and required resources he didn't have, but to drive it, to hurt it, to push it toward the tear that was still contracting, still oscillating, still cycling at 3.7 seconds. The demon hit the tears edge at the cycle's trough, and the dimensional aperture, contracting around it, did what contracting apertures did to things caught in them. It rejected the intrusion, expelled it with the violent finality of a wound closing around something that had no business being there. The tear sealed. The cistern was silent. Seth lowered the disruptor and looked at the space where the demon had been with the expression of someone who had lived in the underhive long enough to have seen things and was now adding this thing to the list and moving on, because that was what living here required. RoboCop ran a full sensor sweep of the cistern. No residual warp field distortion. No dimensional anomaly. No 3.7-second oscillation cycle. The ferrocrete walls had lost their translucence. The temperature readings were consistent across multiple scans. The tear was gone. His transit data, still in his buffer memory, still at 73%. Correlation with a dimensional signature that no longer existed in local space. Updated its status to return path, unavailable. He stood in the ancient dry cistern on a forge world in a universe 10,000 years into a war it was losing by increments. And he filed that update in the category of things that were true and that changed nothing about what needed to be done next. Above him, Cortez was holding a corridor against a Skitarii cohort. Kale was managing institutions that wanted RoboCop in pieces. Ortonval's family was in a Medicae station on level 11. 100 million people lived in a hive city where the law had forgotten what it was for. He looked at Seth. "We need to get back to level 11, he said. She was already moving. The corridor battle on level 20 had been running for 6 hours by the time RoboCop and Seth reached Cortez's position, and it had the particular quality of engagements that neither side had fully committed to ending the Skitarii cohort, pressing forward with the methodical persistence of soldiers who did not experience doubt. Cortez's kill team holding with the immovable patience of post-human warriors who had defended positions against worse odds than this and understood that endurance was its own form of weapon. The corridor was narrow, enough that the Skitarii's numerical advantage compressed into irrelevance, and narrow enough that the Crimson Fist's physical scale ceased to be a liability and became a wall. RoboCop assessed the tactical situation in the 4 seconds it took him to reach Cortez's position and identified 3 things immediately. The Skitarii cohort was operating under retrieval parameters that prohibited destruction of the primary target, which constrained their engagement rules in ways their commanders had not fully accounted for. Cortez had identified this constraint and was using it, holding ground that a purely destructive force would have taken an hour ago. And the cohort's Skitarii Alpha was Vox communicating with someone above the tactical level, which meant decisions were being made somewhere other than this corridor. The decisions, it turned out, were being made by Mugos Veth. She appeared at the cohort's rear, not in person, but on a hololithic projector that a Skitarii communications unit had deployed in the corridor's wider section behind the engagement line. Her lens arrays focused on RoboCop, across the distance and the chaos of the engagement with the precision of instruments. That didn't require optimal conditions to function. The firing on both sides stopped, not by order, exactly by the collective recognition that something had changed in the situation structure. Unit Murphy, Veth said. Her voice carried through. The Vox system with the flat binary. Harmonics of a being who had not used biological vocal cords in a very long time. The Skitarii cohort will stand down. I wish to speak. Cortez looked at RoboCop. RoboCop looked at the hololithic projection. He had been building a model of Muggos. Veth since the forge chamber, the particular quality of her curiosity, the way she had stood her ground when the others retreated, the fact that she had filed a relic claim rather than an immediate destruction order. The model said, "This is a scientist." Scientists, in his experience, wanted to understand things before they destroyed them. Sometimes that window of wanting to understand was negotiable. "Talk," he said. Veth's lens arrays contracted and expanded. "The dimensional tear is closed. My sensors confirm this. The anomalous energy signature that accompanied your arrival has been reduced to background trace levels. A pause measured in machine time. Milliseconds that carried the weight of significant processing. You closed it." "Yes." "The Tsi-ancient entity that was using it as an anchor point has been expelled." "Yes." "You did this with a standard pattern ballistic weapon, an underhive civilian, and a psychic disruptor of inquisitorial manufacture." The lens arrays contracted to their smallest diameter. "The senior magi on Mars have been reviewing my transmission data from your initial examination. They have reached a conclusion that supersedes my retrieval mandate." RoboCop waited. "You are not a relic," Veth said. "You are not an abominable intelligence. You are not a standard template, construct fragment, or a lost technology of the Dark Age. Another machine time pause. You are something the omniscience theology does not have a category for, and the senior magi have determined that an entity without a category is more valuable operating than dissected." Her voice shifted by a frequency, subtle, but his audio processing caught it. "They also note that your chassis closed the dimensional tear using applied ballistic kinetics and pattern recognition, which is a methodology that none of our electro-priest congregations or Skitarii cohorts achieved in 6 hours of attempting to contain the manifestation from the surface." A final pause. "The retrieval mandate is withdrawn." The Skitarii cohort stood down with the instantaneous compliance of soldiers, whose entire decision-making architecture ran through a chain of command, rather than individual judgment. Cortez exhaled, a sound that in a space marine represented a significant quantity of released tension. "That's the first time I've seen a Mechanicus cohort stop mid-operation, because Mars changed its mind," he said quietly. "Mars rarely changes its mind," Veth's projection said, with the flat precision of someone providing accurate information. "Mars updated its model. There is a distinction." Her lens arrays found RoboCop again. "The Mechanicus will not pursue you. You have my personal assurance and the formal assurance of Forge World Command. What you do with that assurance is not our concern." A pause that carried something his model of Veth classified as the closest to heavily augmented Muggos. Explorator came to respect. "You are very strange, Unit Murphy. I find I am glad you are not in pieces." The hololithic projection cut out. The corridor was quiet for the first time in 6 hours. Kale had managed the institutional negotiation to a conclusion by the time they reached level 11, a formal, inquisitorial determination that RoboCop status was classified Xenos adjacent sentient, a designation that carried legal personhood under Imperial law and placed him outside the jurisdiction of the Mechanicus relic statutes. It was not a perfect solution. It was the solution available within the architecture of Imperial law as it currently existed, worked by a man who understood that architecture's limitations and had spent 30 years finding the spaces within it where imperfect things could survive. Orton Vall was in the Medici station with his family. His children were asleep, all 3 of them. The youngest boy curled against his father's side with the complete physical trust of a child who had decided the present moment was safe. Sarah sat beside them, awake, her eyes carrying the specific quality of someone who had run the probability calculations of their situation and arrived at an answer she hadn't expected. RoboCop stood in the Medici station doorway for a moment before Vall noticed him. "The sentence," Vall said. "It's not gone. They'll refile it. Different court, different charge, they'll find something." "Kale is working on it," RoboCop said. "The Inquisitor has jurisdiction to vacate Imperial sentences that fail minimum evidentiary standards. Your conviction fails minimum evidentiary standards. A pause. It will take time. The process is imperfect. Everything here is imperfect, Vol said. Yes, RoboCop agreed. That's not a reason to stop. Vol looked at him with the expression of someone deciding whether to ask the question they'd been holding. What happens to you now? You're stuck here. The tear is closed. You told Seth. I told Seth. And RoboCop looked at the sleeping children, at Sarah's watchful eyes, at the Medicae station beyond them, where Underhive residents from the Generatorium were still being treated, their neurological profiles slowly normalizing, their faces in recovery, carrying the particular vulnerable openness of people who had been somewhere terrible and come back from it. He thought about the 100 million people in Hive Vaulties, about the levels below 14 where no law reached, about the Arbites precinct above, where Draken was reading reports, with the expression of someone who had started asking questions she'd been avoiding, about the Hive cities on other worlds of the Imperium, each with their own underhives, their own forgotten populations, their own gap between what the law said it was and what it actually did. He thought about Detroit, about a city that had needed someone to mean it. There's work to do, he said. Kale found him on the level 11. Exterior walkway an hour later, a rare outdoor space in the Hive's midsection, open to the perpetual industrial sky of Forgeway Secundus. The air thick with particulate matter that his sensors filtered automatically. The Inquisitor stood beside him and looked at the Hive's exterior surface, the accumulated centuries of it, the weight and scale of an institution so old it had forgotten its own foundations. I've drafted a formal request to Sector Command, Kale said, requesting your operational attachment to my retinue. Classified capacity. It gives you legal cover to operate in Imperial space, at least within my jurisdiction. A pause. It's not a badge. It's not a precinct. It's the closest thing available. It'll do, RoboCop said. There are conditions. You operate within the bounds of my inquisitorial mandate. You consult with me before taking unilateral action in situations with significant political consequence. He paused. The Plaza incident would qualify as significant political consequence. Understood. I'm not asking you not to intervene. I'm asking you to give me 30 seconds warning before you do, so I can position myself to manage the aftermath. Kale's voice carried the dry precision of a man who had accepted that the person next to him was going to do things that created work and had decided the work was worth it. One more thing. Arbitrator Signoris Draken has requested a formal meeting. Not an institutional meeting, a personal one. She wants to talk to you directly. RoboCop processed this. When? Tomorrow. She suggested the Level 7 Precinct Annex. Neutral ground, technically. A pause. She also filed a formal complaint against the execution proceeding on Vol's behalf, through official channels, citing insufficient evidentiary standards. Kale's tone was precisely neutral in the way that concealed something that might, in another man, have been called satisfaction. The system contains people trying to use it correctly. They're not always winning, but they're there. RoboCop looked at the industrial sky of Forgeway Secundus, the bruised orange of it, the permanent haze of a world that had been manufacturing things for 10,000 years without pause. Somewhere below, the Underhive was doing what it always did, surviving, adapting, enduring the weight of everything above it with the patient stubbornness of people who had been given no alternative. Somewhere in that survival, Seth was moving through corridors she knew better than anyone, carrying the knowledge that something had changed, not the system, not the structure, not the 10,000-year weight of Imperial law bearing down on the people at the bottom of it, but something, the specific, granular, irreplaceable something of. Last night someone came down here, and it mattered that they did. He understood, finally and completely, what his directives meant in a universe like this one. Serve the public trust. There was a public here that had never been trusted. He could start there. Protect the innocent. The innocents were everywhere. He could start anywhere. Uphold the law. Not Imperial law as written. Not OCP's law as administered. The law underneath those laws. The one that every legal system was supposed to be a flawed attempt at reaching. The law that said people mattered. That suffering was not a resource. That the measure of any system of authority. was what it did for the person who had nothing. He had no precinct. He had no badge. He had no jurisdiction recognized by any authority in this universe except one man's inquisitorial warrant. He had his directives. He had the underhive. He had a meeting tomorrow with an arbitrator who had left a door open. It was enough to begin. In the grim dark of the far future. In a galaxy drowning. In war and dogma and the slow entropy of a civilization. Too old and too vast to reform itself from above. One dead man in a titanium body looked at the work ahead and recognized it for what it was. Not a mission, not a program, not a directive, a reason. He did not fix the Imperium. No single being could. Not the Emperor on his golden throne. Not the Primarchs who had tried. Not the 10,000 years of Inquisitors in space. Marines and ordinary people who had spent there. Lives in the grinding effort of holding a civilization, together with faith and blood and will. The Imperium was too old, too vast, too deeply weighted, with its own history to be fixed by anything that arrived from outside it. But in Hive Voltes, on a forge world at the edge of the Segmentum Solar, something changed. The Underhive acquired, gradually and then consistently, a protector who meant it, who came back, who remembered names and faces and the specific texture of injustices filed for follow-up. The Arbite's precinct on Level 7 developed. Over months, an informal working relationship with an inquisitorial operative who approached the law the way a structural engineer approached a damaged building, not with contempt for the structure, but with precise identification of where it was failing and what could be done about it from inside. Orton Vall's conviction was vacated. His family remained on Level 11, in a HAB unit with functioning lighting and a maintenance contract, because Inquisitor Kale had certain administrative tools available to him and chose to use them. Mugos Veth continued her research. She filed 17 papers on anomalous dimensional transit, events, and their relationship to warp field dynamics. She never quite stopped thinking about the machine that had come through the tear. Sergeant Cortez of the Crimson Fists returned to his chapter with a report that took him 4 drafts to write, because the first 3 kept returning to the question of oaths and what they meant when read plainly, and he wasn't ready to submit that version to anyone yet. In the deep underhive, the dry cistern stayed quiet. Alex Murphy stayed on the job. In a universe that had forgotten what law was for, one cop remembered. Live long and prosper. More stories await.